The wind howled across the barren Ohio plains, rattling the loose window panes of the decaying farmhouse. Inside, the air was thick with the smell of cheap coffee and unspoken despair. A mother stood at the edge of her breaking point. The illusion of her marriage had finally shattered, leaving her stranded in a sea of unpaid bills and hungry mouths. This is not just a story of a broken home. It is a cinematic journey of a woman pushed to the absolute brink, only to discover that the greatest miracles often arrive disguised as absolute tragedies. Prepare yourself for a tale where a single act of kindness alters the fabric of fate. Sarah had never known an easy life. Cast into the foster care system at age 5, she learned early on that love was a conditional currency. She survived by fading into the background, pouring her silent agony into charcoal drawings on scrap paper. When she met Mark, she was a fragile 20-year-old desperate for a permanent address. Mark was older, charming, and promised her the world. But the charm faded the moment the ink dried on their marriage license. Over 10 years, they had 3 children: Tyler, Sam, and little Lily. Mark's ambition withered into profound laziness. He forced the family to move to a crumbling rural property, claiming it was a chance to live off the land. In reality, it was an excuse for him to quit his job and avoid responsibility. Sarah was left to hold the sky up by herself, working night shifts at a local dairy processing plant just to keep the lights on. The tension in the house was a loaded gun, and the trigger was about to be pulled. The rusted hinge of the screen door whined, shattering the fragile silence of the dimly lit kitchen. Sarah stood at the sink. Her hands, rough and cracked from cheap dish soap, gripped the edge of the porcelain basin. The scent of boiled macaroni and stale air hung heavy in the room. 9-year-old Tyler stood in the doorway. His breathing was heavy. Dirt smeared his pale cheeks. But it was his jacket that made Sarah's heart drop into her stomach. The navy blue winter coat. The one she had saved up for months to buy from the clearance rack at the department store. It was completely ruined. A jagged tear ran from the shoulder all the way down to the hem. White stuffing spilled out like a wounded animal. Tyler refused to meet her eyes. He stared at the scuffed linoleum floor. The silence stretched, thick and suffocating. Sarah wanted to scream. She wanted to collapse onto the cold floor and weep. The bank account was practically empty. The winter frost was already creeping across the Ohio plains. There was no money for a new coat. Not this week. Not this month. She took a slow, trembling breath. The air tasted metallic. She closed her eyes, fighting back the burning tears. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely a whisper. She did not yell. The absolute defeat in her voice was far worse than any anger. Before Sarah could say another word, the heavy oak front door slammed shut. Heavy footsteps echoed down the narrow hallway. Mark stepped into the kitchen. He did not look at Tyler. He did not look at the ruined jacket. His eyes swept over the room with a look of utter disgust, a look Sarah had grown far too accustomed to over the past year. He dropped his dirty work boots near the radiator and let out an exaggerated sigh. He walked straight to the refrigerator, yanking the handle so hard the bottles inside rattled. The cold, fluorescent light illuminated his hardened, unshaven face. Sarah watched him rummage through the sparse shelves. She felt a familiar knot of anxiety tighten in her chest. Mark pulled out a small container of strawberry yogurt. It was the only one left. Sarah had bought it specifically for Lily's breakfast the next morning. A sudden, white-hot surge of anger pierced through her chronic exhaustion. She lunged forward, moving faster than she had in years. She snatched the plastic cup right out of his hands. Mark blinked, momentarily stunned by her defiance. His face quickly morphed into a mask of pure rage. He glared at her, his jaw clenching tightly. The air in the small kitchen turned to ice. Mark took a menacing step toward her. His voice was low, vibrating with a venomous contempt that made the hair on Sarah's arm stand up. He looked at her as if she were a complete stranger. He sneered, his lip curling upward. He told her he was sick of this life. He was sick of the noise, the poverty, the constant demands. He blamed her for having too many children. He blamed her for trapping him in a life he never wanted. Sarah stood her ground, clutching the small yogurt container to her chest like a shield, her heart hammered wildly against her ribs. She stared back at the man she had promised to love forever. He was a ghost. The man she married was entirely gone, replaced by a bitter, hollow shell. She whispered, asking him how he could say such horrific things about his own flesh and blood. Mark simply laughed. It was a dry, hollow sound that held no humour. He turned on his heel, muttering curses under his breath, and retreated to the bedroom. The door slammed shut with a finality that made the kitchen windows rattle. Sarah stood frozen in the centre of the room. The oppressive silence returned, heavier and darker than before. The following afternoon, the sky was a bruised purple, threatening rain. Sarah returned home from her shift at the dairy plant. Her muscles ached, and her uniform smelled faintly of sour milk and bleach. As she walked up the gravel driveway, she noticed the front door was wide open. A cold draft swept through the hallway. The kids were standing in the living room, frozen like statues. In the centre of the worn, floral rug sat two large duffel bags. Mark was aggressively shoving a stack of flannel shirts into a leather suitcase. He didn't even pause when Sarah walked in. The metallic zip of the luggage sounded unnaturally loud. Sarah dropped her keys on the side table. They hit the wood with a sharp clatter. She crossed her arms, trying to suppress the violent trembling in her hands. She asked him where he was going. Mark stood up, puffing his chest out. He looked smug, almost triumphant. He announced that he was done. He had found someone else, someone who actually understood him, someone who didn't weigh him down with endless burdens. He slung the heavy bag over his shoulder. The children watched in terrified silence. Sam, the middle child, gripped his older brother's shirt. Mark marched toward the door without a single backward glance at the lives he was destroying. As Mark strutted toward the porch, determined to make a dramatic and cruel exit, his heavy work boot caught the edge of a warped floorboard. It was the exact same floorboard Sarah had begged him to fix for the last 6 months. Gravity took over instantly. Mark let out an undignified yelp, his arms flailing wildly in the air. The heavy leather suitcase swung forward, throwing him completely off balance. He crashed onto the wooden porch with a thunderous thud, sliding face first across the dusty boards. A cloud of dirt plumed into the air around him. For a split second, there was absolute silence. Then a short, sharp giggle escaped Tyler's lips. Sam joined in. Even little Lily offered a tiny, confused smile. Sarah pressed her hand over her mouth. She knew she shouldn't laugh. Her marriage was over. She was now a single mother of 3 with practically 0 income. But the sheer poetic justice of the moment was entirely irresistible. A genuine, bubbling laugh escaped her throat. Mark scrambled to his feet. His face was flushed crimson with humiliation and rage. He kicked the broken board, swearing loudly, grabbed his bag, and practically ran to his rusted pickup truck. The tyre squealed violently as he tore down the driveway, leaving a trail of grey dust in his wake. The house felt strange that evening. The oppressive weight of Mark's constant dissatisfaction had vanished, leaving a hollow, echoing void. Sarah sat on the edge of her bed, long after the children had gone to sleep. Outside, the crickets chirped a rhythmic, endless song. She stared at the empty side of the mattress. The sheets were perfectly smooth. There was no going back now. The terrifying reality of her situation began to sink its claws into her chest. How would she buy groceries? How would she pay the property taxes? She pulled her knees to her chest, resting her chin on them. She allowed herself exactly 10 minutes to cry. Hot, silent tears streamed down her cheeks, soaking into the fabric of her worn sweatpants. She mourned the dream of a happy family she had desperately clung to since her lonely days in the foster care system. But as the clock struck midnight, she wiped her face with the back of her hand. She took a deep, shuddering breath. The tears stopped. A fierce, protective fire ignited in her belly. She was a survivor. She had survived worse than Mark. She stood up, walked to the kitchen, and began preparing the dough for tomorrow's breakfast. She would not let her children see her break. Sunlight streamed through the grimy kitchen window, casting long, golden patterns on the floorboards. The smell of frying batter and melting butter filled the entire house. Sarah flipped a golden brown pancake in the cast iron skillet. The sizzling sound was incredibly comforting. Lily padded into the kitchen. Her blonde hair was a wild, tangled mess from sleep. She rubbed her eyes and clutched her favourite stuffed rabbit. She looked up at Sarah with large, innocent blue eyes. Sarah smiled, a genuine, warm smile that reached her eyes. She scooped the little girl up, burying her face in the child's warm neck. She told Lily to go wake up her brothers. Today was going to be a good day. Within minutes, the kitchen was chaos. Tyler and Sam were covered in flour. They were arguing over who got to pour the maple syrup. Sarah watched them, feeling a strange sense of liberation. For the first time in years, she didn't have to hush them. She didn't have to worry about waking up a furious, hungover husband. The house was theirs. The air felt lighter. Even the family cat, a massive orange tabby named Meatball, seemed to sense the change. He strutted into the kitchen, his tail held high, demanding his share of breakfast with a loud, raspy meow. The sudden roar of a heavy diesel engine shattered their peaceful morning. Tyres crunched aggressively on the gravel driveway. Sarah peeked through the floral curtains. A rusted blue pickup truck was idling near the porch. The driver's side door swung open, and out stepped Chloe. Chloe was a force of nature. She worked at the local diner and baked the best pies in the county. She had bright red hair, a booming laugh, and a fierce loyalty to her friends. She marched up the porch steps carrying a massive white cardboard box. She kicked the doorframe twice. Sarah opened the door, wiping flour from her forehead. Chloe practically shoved the box of fresh jelly donuts into Sarah's arms. Her eyes were wide with excitement and outrage. She had already heard the town gossip. In a town this small, news travelled faster than a prairie fire. Chloe demanded the full story. As the kids eagerly attacked the sugary donuts, the two women sat on the back porch with steaming mugs of black coffee. Sarah recounted the events of the previous evening. Chloe listened intently. When Sarah finished, Chloe slammed her hand down on the wooden railing. She declared that Mark was a worthless coward, and that Sarah was infinitely better off without his miserable presence dragging her down. Later that week, Sarah took a deep breath and walked into the county courthouse. The building was old and smelled of lemon polish and dusty paper. She gripped her cheap purse so tightly her knuckles turned white. She approached the clerk's desk to file the divorce papers and officially request child support. The process was cold and clinical. The clerk stamped the documents with a heavy metallic thud that seemed to echo through Sarah's very soul. It was done. It was in the system. As she walked out of the heavy glass doors into the bright afternoon sunlight, she felt a complex mixture of profound relief and terrifying uncertainty. On her way home, she stopped at the local grocery store to buy essential supplies. The aisles were narrow and brightly lit. As she turned the corner near the dairy section, she froze. Standing right there near the milk coolers was Mark. He was not alone. Clinging tightly to his arm was Tiffany, the young woman who worked at the hardware store. Tiffany had bright pink acrylic nails and wore a sickly sweet perfume that Sarah could smell from 10 feet away. The air between them instantly crackled with thick, unspoken hostility. Mark's eyes widened in panic for a fraction of a second before he masked it with a sneer. Tiffany looked Sarah up and down, a smug, condescending smile playing on her glossy lips. Sarah felt her pulse pounding in her ears. She gripped the handle of her shopping cart. Mark opened his mouth, clearly preparing to say something cruel, but Sarah beat him to the punch. Her voice was remarkably steady. It was cold, sharp, and cut through the ambient noise of the grocery store like a surgeon's scalpel. She informed him that the divorce papers were filed and the county would be garnishing his wages for child support. Tiffany's smug smile instantly vanished. She whipped her head around to look at Mark, her eyes flashing with sudden anger. She demanded to know what Sarah was talking about. Mark had clearly lied to her about his financial obligations. Mark began to stutter, his face flushing a deep, embarrassed red. Sarah didn't stay to watch the fallout. She pushed her cart past them with her head held high. A triumphant thrill surged through her veins. For the first time in a decade, she felt powerful. She felt like she was finally taking control of the narrative of her own life. Autumn gave way to the bitter chill of early winter. The nights in the farmhouse grew incredibly long and dark. One evening, after the children were fast asleep, Sarah sat by the dying embers of a fire pit in the backyard. She pulled her thick woolen shawl tighter around her shoulders. The sky was an endless ocean of glittering stars. Chloe sat across from her, poking the glowing coals with a long, blackened stick. Chloe was unusually quiet tonight. Her usual boisterous energy was completely subdued. Sarah asked her what was wrong. Chloe let out a long, shaky sigh. Her boyfriend, Deputy Carter, was pressing for a serious commitment. He wanted her to move into his place in town. Chloe confessed she was absolutely terrified. Her past was littered with toxic relationships and broken promises. She didn't know how to trust a good man. Sarah reached across the smoke and squeezed her friend's hand. She spoke softly, her voice carrying the weight of her own painful experiences. She told Chloe not to let past ghosts dictate her future happiness. They talked for hours, the fire slowly dying down to a dull, pulsing orange glow. The crisp night air smelled of wood smoke and impending snow. It was well past midnight when Chloe finally drove away. Sarah stood on the porch, watching the red tail lights disappear down the dark country road. She turned to go back inside, the cold seeping through her thick socks. Suddenly, a strange sound caught her attention. It was a soft, ragged intake of breath. The hair on the back of Sarah's neck stood up. She froze, straining her eyes against the impenetrable darkness near the edge of the property. The old wooden fence cast long, menacing shadows. A figure detached itself from the gloom. Sarah's heart slammed against her ribs. She tightened her grip on the porch railing, ready to bolt inside and lock the heavy deadbolt. A voice drifted through the freezing air. It was frail, trembling, and unmistakably female. The woman begged Sarah not to be afraid. She stepped slowly into the pale pool of light cast by the porch bulb. Sarah gasped. Standing before her was an elderly woman. She looked to be in her late 60s. Her clothes were little more than filthy rags, caked in mud and dried blood. She was shivering so violently her teeth audibly chattered. Her face was gaunt, but her eyes held a desperate, intelligent light. She looked completely out of place in this desolate rural setting. Sarah hesitated for only a fraction of a second. The primal instinct to protect the vulnerable overrode any sense of caution. She rushed down the wooden steps, the freezing gravel biting into her feet through her socks. She reached the older woman. Up close, the smell of unwashed bodies and metallic copper was overwhelming. The woman's lips were tinted a dangerous shade of blue. Sarah wrapped her arms around the trembling stranger, supporting her frail weight. She practically dragged the woman up the steps and into the warm sanctuary of the house. The bright kitchen lights revealed the full extent of the horror. The woman's bare feet were a catastrophic mess of open wounds and deep blisters. It looked as if she had been walking barefoot on jagged asphalt for weeks. Sarah guided her to the kitchen chair. The woman collapsed into it, completely exhausted. Sarah asked her name. The woman stared blankly at the wall. A tear carved a clean path through the dirt on her hollow cheek. She whispered that she didn't know. She couldn't remember her name, her home, or how she got here. Her mind was a terrifying, absolute blank. The panic in her eyes was heartbreakingly real. Sarah rushed to the bathroom and grabbed a plastic basin, medical gauze, and antiseptic. She filled the basin with warm, soapy water. She knelt on the hard linoleum floor in front of the stranger. Gently, with the utmost care, she placed the woman's ruined feet into the water. The woman let out a sharp hiss of pain, her hands gripping the edges of the chair until her knuckles turned white. Sarah apologized softly, her voice a steady, calming hum. As she washed away the grime, she noticed the woman's hands. Despite the dirt, the nails were perfectly manicured, and the skin was soft. These were not the hands of a lifelong vagrant. These were the hands of a woman accustomed to luxury. As the warm water worked its magic, the stranger introduced herself. She said she had been calling herself Eleanor because the police refused to help her without a name. They had dismissed her as a crazy homeless wanderer. Eleanor touched a large, crusted lump hidden beneath her matted grey hair. She winced. Someone had struck her violently from behind. The memory of the blow was the only thing she retained. Everything else was a dark, suffocating void. Sarah bandaged Eleanor's feet, wrapping them tightly in clean white gauze. She heated up a bowl of leftover vegetable soup and watched as the starving woman ate. Eleanor ate slowly, carefully, displaying table manners that seemed deeply ingrained despite her desperate hunger. Sarah prepared the worn sleeper sofa in the living room, piling it high with every spare blanket she could find in the house. She gave Eleanor an oversized flannel nightgown. When Eleanor finally lay down, she looked at Sarah with eyes brimming with profound gratitude. She reached out, her frail fingers brushing Sarah's rough hand. She whispered a blessing, promising that the universe would repay this incredible kindness. Sarah simply smiled, turning off the harsh overhead light. She retreated to her own bedroom, locking the door out of habit. She lay awake for hours, staring at the cracked plaster ceiling. Her rational mind screamed that taking in a complete stranger was insanely dangerous, but her heart, scarred by years of feeling unwanted and abandoned in the foster system, knew she had made the only acceptable choice. The morning sun broke through the heavy grey clouds, casting a crisp light across the frost-covered yard. Eleanor woke to the sensation of being watched. She opened her eyes slowly. Standing in a neat line by the edge of the sofa were Tyler, Sam, and little Lily. They stared at her with wide, unblinking curiosity. Eleanor felt a sudden spike of panic, her survival instincts kicking in. But before she could react, Lily stepped forward. She was clutching a battered plastic stethoscope. She gravely announced that Eleanor was sick, but her mom could fix anything. The innocent, absolute faith in the child's voice melted Eleanor's fear instantly. She offered a weak, trembling smile. Sarah walked into the room, wiping her hands on a dish towel. She scolded the children mildly for bothering their guest, but her tone was warm. The boys immediately started asking questions. Where did she come from? Why were her feet wrapped up like a mummy? Eleanor laughed softly, a sound that felt entirely foreign in her own throat. She told them she was on an adventure but got a little lost. The kids seemed perfectly satisfied with this explanation. From that moment on, she was simply Grandma Ellie. Later that afternoon, Chloe's rusted truck slammed to a halt in the driveway. She practically kicked the front door open, her arms full of groceries. She stopped dead in her tracks. Sitting at the kitchen table, peeling potatoes with surprising efficiency, was an elderly stranger. Chloe's jaw dropped. She pulled Sarah into the hallway, her voice a frantic, hushed whisper. She demanded to know what on earth Sarah was thinking. She listed all the terrifying possibilities. The woman could be a fugitive, a thief, or dangerously insane. Sarah held up her hands, begging for calm. She explained the horrific state Eleanor was in when she found her. She explained the terrible gaping hole in the woman's memory. Chloe paced the narrow hallway, running her hands through her bright red hair. Finally, she stopped and pointed a finger at Sarah. She declared that she was calling Deputy Carter immediately. He needed to run the woman's fingerprints and check the National Missing Persons database. Sarah agreed, knowing it was the safest and most logical course of action. They returned to the kitchen. Eleanor looked up from the potatoes, her intelligent eyes scanning their faces. She knew exactly what they were planning, and she offered a slow, approving nod. Weeks turned into a bitter, snowy month. The farmhouse was transformed by Eleanor's presence. She couldn't walk long distances, but her impact on the household was monumental. She possessed a quiet, unshakable authority that the children instantly respected. One evening, Tyler was on the verge of tears, frustrated by his complicated math homework. Sarah was exhausted from a double shift and felt her own patience fraying. Eleanor quietly pulled a chair next to the boy. With a calm, melodic voice, she began to explain the complex fractions. She didn't yell. She didn't belittle him. She used an analogy about baking pies that made the numbers suddenly click in Tyler's brain. For the first time all year, Tyler brought home a perfect test score. Furthermore, Eleanor proved to be an organizational genius. She established daily routines that made the chaotic mornings run like clockwork. The house was cleaner. The meals were better planned. Sarah found herself coming home to a warm kitchen and a sense of profound peace. The crushing weight of single motherhood was finally shared. The four of them had organically formed a strange, beautiful, makeshift family in the middle of nowhere. One Sunday afternoon, the winter sun was unusually bright. Eleanor approached Sarah, who was sitting on the porch steps, staring tiredly at the snow-covered fields. Eleanor suggested it was time for a change. She touched Sarah's dull, split ends with the professional's eye. She claimed that while she couldn't remember her past, her hands possessed a muscle memory that she entirely trusted. She asked Sarah to buy a specific brand of hair dye and some sharp shears from the pharmacy in town. Sarah was deeply hesitant. She hadn't spent money on herself in over a decade. But Eleanor's quiet confidence was persuasive. The next day, the kitchen was transformed into a makeshift salon. The children were banished to the living room. Eleanor worked with stunning, rhythmic precision. The scissors flashed silver in the sunlight. When it was finally over, Sarah stared into the cracked bathroom mirror. She gasped, covering her mouth with both hands. The exhausted, defeated woman was gone. Her hair was now a rich, dark chestnut falling in elegant, framing layers around her face. Her cheekbones looked higher. Her eyes looked brighter. She looked vibrant. She looked beautiful. Eleanor smiled proudly, her eyes crinkling at the corners. To celebrate Sarah's incredible transformation and the kids' good report cards, they decided to host a modest backyard barbecue, despite the lingering chill in the air. The fire pit blazed brightly, casting dancing shadows against the side of the house. Chloe arrived early, her laughter ringing out across the frozen yard. She couldn't stop staring at Sarah, continuously exclaiming that she looked like a Hollywood movie star. Just as Tyler was flipping the cheap hot dogs on the grill, a sleek black SUV rolled down the gravel driveway. It looked entirely alien next to Chloe's rusted truck. Deputy Carter stepped out of the driver's side. From the passenger side emerged a man who commanded immediate attention. He wore a tailored wool overcoat that screamed of urban wealth. He was tall, with sharp features and a look of intense, weary determination. Carter introduced him as Julian, an old college friend from Chicago who worked in high-end real estate development. Julian swept his gaze across the humble gathering. His eyes locked onto Sarah. He paused, clearly struck by her striking appearance against the backdrop of the dilapidated farmhouse. The atmosphere shifted, charged with a sudden, electric curiosity. Just as Carter was introducing Julian to the group, the rusty hinge of the front gate shrieked. Everyone turned. Stumbling down the pathway was Mark. He was noticeably thinner, his clothes wrinkled and stained. A strong stench of stale beer preceded him. He glared at the gathering, his eyes bloodshot and full of bitter resentment. He demanded to know who these strangers were on his property. Sarah stepped forward, placing herself squarely between Mark and the children. Her newly styled hair blew gently in the cold wind. Her voice was pure steel. She reminded him that his name was no longer on the deed. He had abandoned them. Tiffany had clearly kicked him out, and now he was crawling back, looking for a warm bed. Mark lunged forward, raising his hand in a threatening gesture. Before Sarah could even flinch, Julian moved with terrifying speed. He stepped in front of Sarah, grabbing Mark's wrist with a grip like an industrial vice. Julian didn't shout. He leaned in close, his voice a deadly, whispered threat. He suggested Mark turn around and walk away before things got incredibly painful. Mark stared into Julian's cold, calculating eyes. The fight instantly drained out of him. He wrenched his arm free, spat on the frozen ground, and stumbled back down the driveway. The adrenaline of the confrontation slowly faded, replaced by a tense, nervous energy. To distract everyone, Tyler and Sam ran into the house to grab extra blankets. While digging through the top shelf of a dusty hallway closet, a heavy cardboard box toppled over, spilling its contents across the wooden floor. The boys scrambled to pick up the mess. They froze. Scattered across the floorboards were dozens of charcoal drawings and watercolour paintings. They were breathtakingly beautiful, yet undeniably haunting. They depicted stormy landscapes, solitary figures standing in torrential rain, and a single wet kitten huddling beneath a dying autumn leaf. The emotion bleeding through the paper was visceral. Eleanor, who had followed the boys inside, gasped softly. She knelt painfully and picked up the drawing of the kitten. The depth of the shading, the desperate use of negative space. It was the work of a true prodigy. The boys ran outside, waving the papers in the air. They proudly announced they had found secret treasure. Sarah's face drained of all colour. She dropped the plastic tongs onto the grass. She looked as if someone had just ripped open an old, unhealed wound. Sarah rushed forward, snatching the drawings from the boy's hands. She clutched them to her chest, her breathing shallow and fast. Chloe stepped forward, her face a mask of profound shock. She had known Sarah for years and had absolutely no idea she could draw. Sarah turned away, staring into the dark tree line. The memories came flooding back, acidic and burning. She spoke quietly into the cold air. She explained that when she was 7, her foster parents had taken her to an ice cream parlour. They told her to wait at a red booth. They walked out the front door, got into their station wagon, and drove away forever. She was placed in a grim, state-run orphanage where speaking out was punished with dark closets. Drawing became her only voice. She poured all her terror, her isolation, and her silent screams into cheap paper. When she met Mark, he called her art a useless, pathetic waste of time. He threw out her expensive paints. To survive the marriage, she locked her talent away in that dark closet, burying it deep beneath the crushing demands of survival. As she spoke, Julian watched her. His expression was unreadable, but his eyes were entirely captivated by her raw, exposed vulnerability. That night, after the guest had left and the house was draped in heavy silence, Sarah could not sleep. The Pandora's box of her past had been ripped wide open. She walked quietly to the kitchen table. Under the pale glow of a single bulb, she laid out the old drawings. Next to them, she placed a cheap set of children's watercolours and a blank sheet of heavy paper she had found in Sam's school supplies. Her hands trembled violently as she picked up a frayed brush. It had been over a decade. She dipped the brush into the murky water. The moment the wet pigment touched the rough texture of the paper, something inside her fundamentally shifted. The dam broke. For 3 hours she painted like a woman possessed. She painted the crushing weight of the Midwestern sky. She painted the suffocating cold of the farmhouse. But she also painted the warm, golden light of her children's laughter. She poured years of suppressed agony and newly discovered strength onto the canvas. When she finally set the brush down, her hands were stained black and blue. She was exhausted, but her soul felt incredibly, wonderfully light. She had finally reclaimed her stolen voice. The next morning, the heavy thud of a car door echoing in the driveway woke the household. It was Julian. He looked entirely exhausted, dark purple circles bruising the skin under his eyes. Deputy Carter had given him the address. He stood on the porch holding a thick manila folder tight against his chest. Sarah opened the door, pulling her worn cardigan around her shoulders. Julian's voice was uncharacteristically shaky. He explained that he wasn't just in town to visit Carter. He was on a desperate, frantic search. He had spent the last 8 months tearing the country apart looking for his missing mother. The private investigators had hit a dead end. The local police had given up. Carter had called him, mentioning an unidentified elderly woman recovering at a farmhouse outside of town. Julian swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing. He asked if he could see her. Sarah's heart began to race. She nodded silently and stepped aside, gesturing toward the kitchen. The smell of brewing coffee filled the narrow hallway. Every floorboard seemed to creak louder than usual as Julian walked slowly toward the back of the house. Eleanor was standing by the antique stove, carefully pouring hot water into a chipped ceramic mug. She wore one of Sarah's oversized woolen sweaters. As Julian stepped into the kitchen doorway, the ambient noise of the house seemed to instantly vanish. Eleanor turned around slowly. The ceramic mug slipped from her fragile, trembling fingers. It shattered violently against the linoleum floor, sending hot water and sharp shards flying in every direction. Neither of them moved. Julian fell to his knees directly onto the hard floor, ignoring the broken ceramic. Tears streamed freely down his face, soaking into the collar of his expensive wool coat. He let out a choked, gut-wrenching sob. He whispered the word Mom over and over again, as if it were a sacred prayer. Eleanor collapsed into his waiting arms. She buried her face into his shoulder, her body shaking with violent, uncontrollable sobs. In that singular, explosive moment of physical contact, the dark, suffocating wall in Eleanor's mind shattered completely. The memories flooded back. She remembered the opulent salon she owned in Chicago. She remembered the smell of expensive hairspray. Most importantly, she remembered the exact face of the monster who had tried to murder her in the dead of night. Sitting at the scarred kitchen table, nursing a cup of black coffee, Julian explained the horrific truth. His wife, a beautiful but deeply malicious woman named Victoria, had orchestrated the entire nightmare. Victoria had married Julian exclusively for his vast real estate fortune. When Eleanor discovered Victoria was systematically embezzling funds from the family accounts, she confronted her daughter-in-law in the sprawling Chicago mansion. Victoria panicked. Under the cover of darkness, she struck Eleanor from behind with a heavy bronze statue, rendering her unconscious. Believing the older woman was dead, Victoria panicked and drove her out to the desolate rural counties, dumping her body in a shallow ditch near the highway. By some absolute miracle, Eleanor had survived the freezing temperatures, wandering blindly in a state of severe fugue amnesia until she stumbled onto Sarah's property. Julian's fists were clenched so tight his knuckles were bone white. He vowed that Victoria would spend the rest of her miserable life rotting in a federal prison. He looked across the table at Sarah. His eyes were burning with an intensity that took her breath away. He told Sarah she hadn't just saved a life, she had saved his entire world. The inevitable departure came 2 days later. The black SUV idled in the gravel driveway, a thick plume of white exhaust rising into the freezing winter air. The children were completely devastated. Little Lily clung fiercely to Eleanor's legs, sobbing uncontrollably into the wool fabric. Eleanor knelt down, her old joints popping in the cold. She kissed away the child's tears, making a solemn, binding promise that they would see each other again very soon. Julian stood near the driver's side door. He looked at Sarah. The silence between them was heavy, loaded with words neither dared to say aloud. He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a sleek modern smartphone and a blank checkbook. He tried to press them into Sarah's hands, insisting he owed her an unpayable debt. Sarah firmly pushed his hands away. She looked him dead in the eyes, her voice steady and proud. She told him that kindness was not a transactional commodity. She hadn't taken Eleanor in for a reward. She did it because it was the right thing to do. Julian stared at her, profoundly moved by her fierce, unyielding dignity. He nodded slowly, climbed into the heavy vehicle, and drove away, leaving a massive, echoing void in the farmhouse. The farmhouse felt unnaturally quiet in the weeks that followed. To combat the crushing silence, Sarah threw herself entirely into her art. Julian had secretly left behind 3 large boxes filled with professional-grade canvases, expensive oil paints, and fine sable brushes. Sarah painted late into the night, the smell of turpentine and linseed oil, replacing the scent of stale despair that used to haunt the rooms. 6 months passed. Spring finally broke through the frozen earth. It was the day of Chloe and Deputy Carter's wedding. The reception was held at the local community hall. Faded crepe paper hung from the ceiling, and the punch bowl was heavily spiked. Sarah wore a simple, elegant thrift store dress. She looked radiant, her dark hair framing a face that was finally at peace. As she stepped out into the dark parking lot to catch her breath, a shadow detached itself from the side of the building. It was Mark. He was completely intoxicated, his breath reeking of cheap whiskey. He cornered her against a parked truck. He spat hateful words, accusing her of ruining his life. He grabbed her arm roughly, his fingers digging painfully into her flesh. He raised his fist, his eyes wild with drunken fury. Before Mark could strike, a massive force collided with him. Mark was thrown backward, crashing violently into a stack of empty metal garbage cans. The deafening clatter echoed across the empty parking lot. Sarah gasped, sliding down the side of the truck. Standing between her and Mark was Julian. He was breathing heavily, his custom suit jacket unbuttoned. He had driven 4 hours straight from Chicago, unable to stay away a moment longer. He looked down at Mark, who was groaning in the trash. Julian didn't even raise his voice. He simply told Mark that if he ever came within 100 miles of Sarah again, the police would be the least of his worries. Mark scrambled away like a terrified rat. Julian turned to Sarah. The cold, intimidating facade instantly vanished. He gently pulled her into his arms, burying his face in her dark hair. He confessed that he had tried to focus on his business, on his mother's recovery, but his mind was constantly anchored to a dilapidated farmhouse in Ohio. He pulled back, looking deeply into her eyes. He told her he wasn't there to offer her a reward. He was there to offer her everything, the rest of his life. Sarah closed her eyes, the tears falling freely, and finally let herself be held. Exactly 1 year later, the harsh Midwestern winters were nothing but a distant memory. Sarah stood in the center of an elite, brightly lit art gallery in downtown Chicago. The polished hardwood floors gleamed under the track lighting. The walls were lined with massive, breathtaking canvases. They were her paintings, the raw, emotional depictions of rural struggle. The dark foster care memories and the brilliant bursts of hope had captured the attention of the city's top art critics. The room was packed with wealthy patrons holding champagne flutes. Julian stood beside her, his arm wrapped protectively around her waist. Across the room, Eleanor was laughing joyfully, holding a beautifully dressed Lily on her hip. Tyler and Sam were wearing miniature tuxedos, looking completely awestruck by the towering skyscrapers visible through the floor-to-ceiling windows. Sarah looked around the room. It felt like an impossible, wonderful dream. She pinched her own wrist, just to make sure she wouldn't wake up back in that freezing, mouldy kitchen. Julian noticed the gesture. He leaned down, his lips brushing against her ear. He whispered that this wasn't a dream. This was the beautiful reality she had earned. The exhibition was a massive success, but the true climax of the evening happened away from the flashing cameras. As the gallery began to empty, Sarah pulled Julian into a quiet, shadowed alcove near the back exit. Her heart hammered a frantic rhythm against her ribs. She looked up at the man who had completely changed her life. With a trembling smile, she whispered the secret she had been holding on to all week. She was pregnant. Julian froze, his eyes widening in absolute shock. For a terrifying second, he said nothing. Then a slow, brilliant smile spread across his face. He lifted her off the floor, spinning her around as his joyous laughter echoed through the empty gallery hall. The broken pieces of their past had perfectly aligned to build an unbreakable future. They had found salvation in the most unlikely of places. If you were moved by Sarah's incredible journey from despair to triumph, please leave a like, subscribe to the channel, and share your thoughts in the comments. We want to know, would you have opened your door to a stranger in the dead of night? Your interactions help us bring more powerful stories to life.